Three, two, one. All right, Michael, thank you so much for joining me today. I know you are crazy busy this time of year. First thing, before we get into the Sun specific trades, because this is a Suns podcast, I want to get a glimpse into the day of the life of a guy like you in going through draft day. What was draft day like? Did you get any sleep last night at all? How often was your phone buzzing? Tell me everything you were hearing yesterday.
I mean, yesterday was a whirlwind. You know, at the draft specifically, I had heard Oklahoma City had given the Knicks the 3 first-round picks, but before reporting it, I started getting word about like other stuff happening and it becoming a multi-team deal. And then, obviously other people are reporting on it too. And some people have some things, some people have another. And I actually joked with one of my guys that one of my sources, like, my head is spinning. He goes, me too. And it was that kind of a complicated evening, I think, certainly when you look at some of those trades. Um,
I think
you
Jake
know,
Fisher. That was with. That was with. Who were the teams involved
the
again? Tell me
Knicks,
that
with
one.
the Knicks, the Thunder, the Hornets, but
That's
there were
right.
other things too that were just even with Paolo
Oh, the Thunder
Banchero.
moved up into the Knicks spot, and the Knicks got future first round picks and stuff, right?
And yeah, and even with Paolo Banchero, I'm talking to his camp like right beforehand to see what's going on, and then you've got um, uh, total uncertainty there. I had wrote
Right.
on Hoopshype that they didn't know what was going on, quite frankly, until a couple of minutes on the clock. They never worked out there. Um, as I have wrote on hoopside.com, they were supposed to take a visit on Sunday, but it fell through. They never ended up rescheduling it. And then while they're on the clock, Orlando, after 8 p.m., then they're finding out. It was unbelievable. The level of secrecy that Orlando had throughout the process, I mean,
And
usually
the level of secrecy with Bankero's own camp. That's wild.
I think just in general, they were extremely tight-lipped on information, and that's fine to an extent. But like, I mean, did Paolo think he could go one? Yeah, but he had no idea till being on the clock. Poor Jabari Smith is sitting there thinking he's the guy, and then he ends up falling to 3. And he never worked out for Houston. You had the Vegas odds makers the night before shifting the odds. Then in the morning, there were reports that it's going to be the typical 1, 2, 3. Then the odds shifted again. Then before the draft, about 30 minutes beforehand, they shifted again. I mean, it was lighting up like Times Square on New Year's Eve. And then you asked me about sleep. I don't know what that is this past week. I really don't. I probably had anywhere between, let's say, on average, 4 to 7 hours a night, depending on what's going on. 7's pushing it.
Yeah.
And now it's like I have a little bit of time, I think, this weekend to kind of catch up. And then, it's like Leonardo DiCaprio. The show goes on, It's just like Wolf of Wall Street. We get right
Hey,
back.
if you're living Leo's life, you're living large. That's good. So let's go. We'll go with that one. So tell me yesterday, how many different teams did you connect with one way or another?
I didn't connect with all 30, but like it was a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
the bigger thing was for me once once the draft was happening and then like it was towards the end, it's more like, all right, well, who's getting a 2-way, who's getting
Right.
exhibit 10s, and then honestly looking really further ahead, and I mean we'll touch on it, but like what's next for some of these bigger free agents? How did the draft affect guys like DeAndre Ayton, Jalen Brunson, guys like that? To me, that was even Tyus Jones. To me, that was the bigger question, I think, ultimately. When you were looking at the landscape, pretty much, and that's what I was trying to do most of the night, and staying up late to write my intel piece for the morning on Hoopside.
Yep. Okay, so let's talk about the Suns here. But before we get to Aiden, did you hear at all? Like, do you hear about teams that are trying to be aggressive even if they don't get things done, or do you mostly hear about it when it's about to get done? I'm curious if the Suns were active just didn't get anything done, or if they were kind of just out of the picture.
I can't really say I heard a ton on the Suns. I would say that I think, for the Suns, the real talk is going to be whether they're going to ultimately bring back Ayton or work the sign and trade conversations. And that's kind of what I wrote about, and I'm sure we're going to get into on this podcast episode. But that was really the main thing. It was more for them towards an eye towards like post the draft and what's coming at the start of free agency, which is a week away as of this recording.
Yeah, right. So we've got this. You and I are recording the day after the draft. Free agency is just under a week away. And at that point, teams can start negotiating with each other. Look, we all know there's a little bit of tampering. There's a lot of talk between teams and agents and players and stuff that goes on behind the scenes. In fact, two teams were so obvious about it last year that they lost their second round picks in this year's draft because they worked so far in advance of actual free agency starting. But let's assume for the moment that there's no real knowledge of if you're going to sign and trade DeAndre Ayton in free agency, there's a lot of parts that have to be put together. That's
Right.
almost too many parts to have coordinated the entire thing ahead of time, right? I mean, it feels like the things that are coordinated ahead of time are players signing with a team.
You
Does
wouldn't,
some
you
big
wouldn't be referencing tampering, Dave, would you?
No, not at all. Not at all. But is this where it's a multi-team required thing where you're doing trades and trying to sign and trade? Does that ever
Um,
happen before July 1, or is that really they wait until July?
I mean, technically it's after July 1, right? I'll go with that.
Or do they
I
have a good feel for each other's desires before
Well,
July
I'll
1?
say this, from your own player, like Phoenix and Ayton can have their own conversations. He's their own player.
Yeah, they can have their own.
I'm sure they're going to have a sense over the next. The way it was explained to me was the draft. Once the draft was done, there would be some follow up conversations there between both sides and to see kind of where things stand. You have to. You're a week away from the draft. Now is the time to do it and really solidify it because ultimately, I think obviously Ayton and his camp still want a max contract. There's no doubt about it. And if Phoenix isn't willing to do that, well, then what's next? Can they get that max offer sheet somewhere else? And, ultimately, you kind of don't want it to get to the offer sheet point, I think, if you're Phoenix, because if he's going to get a max offer sheet, you're not going to let him walk for nothing, but they don't seem to want to pay him a max either. So then, there would be an understanding there of a sign and trade with the said team and trying to get back as many assets as you can where it's feasible. It can definitely be complicated. You saw what happened with the Spencer Dinwiddie deal years ago when he went to Washington. I mean, that was a really complicated thing that took a lot of time. That was absurd. I do remember that, but I think that's ultimately where it's going to be.
Yeah. So with Ayton, like you said, he's looking for a max contract. He always has been. He's never been shy of that. I think I'm assuming his camp understands that going into this summer, if they're going to get an offer, the offer is going to be a little bit less than he wanted a year ago because it's only 4 years and at 5% raises, but it's still the same starting number.
Yeah.
And the Suns are still reluctant just to give it to him right off the bat. I think that's very clear. The Suns are not going to throw that contract at him before July 1 and just say, here we go. Just kidding. They're definitely going to hold out and see what kind of best offer Ayton can get. The biggest suitor going into yesterday was the Detroit Pistons, according to what has come out. But the Pistons drafted an 18-year-old center by trading back into the late lottery. And you wrote today that puts their intentions in question because they might just stay with that rather than go with DeAndre Ayton and a big max. Have you heard any more on that? And what do you really think has changed, if anything?
What I know is that Troy Weaver has had an affinity for DeAndre Ayton since 2017. He's been very high on him. Now, with that said, I know some people around the league wondered once they got Jalen Duren how that would affect things. They also have Isaiah Stewart, who they recently got in the draft. I think when you're a rebuilding team, you got to ask yourself, and I wrote this also for the Pacers as well, if there was a hypothetical scenario where, Miles Turner could be involved in a sign and trade, certainly come up in trade talks. And both Turner and Ayton are represented by Bill Duffy of BDA Sports, so that's something to keep in mind. But for both teams, when you talk to like rival executives, especially, the question becomes, do those rebuilding teams want to invest a max contract in a center? I mean, if it's, Joel Embiid or, Nikola Jokic,
A non-all-star center.
yeah,
that's the question.
That's where what it comes down to. It's hard to say still right now. I think they're still certainly in the mix. I think, some people early on when the report came out about Damian Lillard, if they would move off of Nurkic and go for Ayton, it's not the vibe I'm getting right now. My understanding, and speaking with sources, was that Portland kept Yusuf Nurkic past the trade deadline with the intent to re-sign him in the offseason. And a week away, that remains the case as of now. I think that what's interesting here is then you've got San Antonio potentially has cap space. Can they get more to get Ayton? Do they do a potential sign and trade or something where Jakob Poeltl is involved there? I think that's just a hypothetical. That's not.
Yeah, I've got this feeling that it's interesting because Tim Duncan made a lot of his career as the center as the big man, not wanting ever to call himself a center, but the big man in Greg Popovich's offense. Yeah. And they won 5 championships together. I think it was 5. Was it 4 or 5? But they won a lot of championships together. And not to say that Deandre Ayton has the same mindset or mental toughness as a Tim Duncan, certainly isn't maximizing his skills as much as Tim Duncan did. I can imagine that if there's a coach out there who would make the most of Ayton's skill set, which is not a pick and roll diver, because Tim Duncan was never a pick and roll diver, but he found his offense around the edges of the paint, just like Ayton is, and he can finish obviously inside, and he can defend well. It seems like Greg Popovich would be one of those guys who would say, "Look, man, I'm going to make him an all-star, and we're going to win a championship."
I mean, you would certainly think that, but again, they're in a rebuilding situation. What do they do with DeJounte Murray? Obviously, the asking price on him is high, but even the fact that he was available kind of raised a little bit.
Yeah, right. That was weird.
I can't say I was totally shocked by it, but because like quietly, he always had a high asking price, and if somebody was willing to meet it, they would listen. But this is a guy that's a mid-20s all-star that can get a triple-double on a nightly basis. So. Right. I think now time will tell on that, but Ayton has to, for Ayton to get the max money he wants, he has to get it somewhere else because he's not getting it in Phoenix. That's what this really boils down to ultimately, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is, so when it comes to total like cap flexibility, there are teams out there who could put together the cap flexibility to sign him to an offer sheet, but really it's not going to be. It's going to be a sign and trade. The Suns are not going to let him go.
And Dave, I would look at the Hawks, Dave. Just one other team to keep in mind, because Clint Capella's there, played with Chris Paul. They're a young team. Trae Young is around the same age as Ayton. They want to keep DeAndre Hunter and extend him. They've got Onyeka Okongwu. I think that Ayton would fit their core better in a way than Clint Capella. So just something to keep an eye on there for sure, I would say.
Yeah, I've heard. I haven't heard anything specific on Atlanta for sure. They did keep John Collins past the draft, which people thought he would be traded by the draft. That could net better return for the Suns in a sign and trade, but you definitely, I think it's going to have to, as you're saying, it has to be a sign and trade. No one's going to sign Ayton outright, and then the Suns allow him to just leave to an offer sheet. So while Detroit might be close to being able to wanting to do that, the Suns wouldn't just let him go.
No.
So it'll be really interesting. I think the teams you've listed are the most likely. Obviously, I did wonder if there's going to be any surprise teams, but really, then it becomes a lot more complicated, and you don't know who's trying to get rid of who. What's the latest you heard now? I know it came out yesterday. I think it was just yesterday that Kevin Durant has officially, or at least publicly, made it known that he is willing to look at other teams and possibly leave the Nets and tell Kyrie to go do what he wants. What's the latest on that?
The latest on that is there's obviously a little bit of tension there between Kyrie Irving and Brooklyn Nets management. I think I would imagine within the next couple of days they're going to figure this out because we're a week before free agency, and then you've got other dominoes, going into effect. When you talk to other agents and stuff, and them trying to figure out if Brooklyn could be a fit for their guy for a bench role, that's not their priority right now, Brooklyn. Their priority is trying to figure out this whole Kyrie thing, and then all the dominoes fall from there. I mean, ideally, I can tell you that Brooklyn wanted to go into this upcoming season with Durant, Irving, Simmons, Joe Harris, and that core, and really try to compete. They felt good about their roster and what they could be. Ultimately, obviously, that hinges on Kyrie Irving. I think when it comes to Kyrie's wanted to stay in Brooklyn. He's wanted to do this with Kevin Durant. He's clearly using Durant as leverage to get the full money that he wants, or as close to it as he can. At some point, this is going to come to a head. I had written a story previously on Hoopshype that, a lot of teams out there were afraid of trading for Kyrie Irving, quite frankly. I don't know if the appetite for him now has changed. Again, he remains unvaccinated. Could that ever creep up and be an issue again if the COVID pandemic changes? And depending on what city you're in, I think that could that's something that.
Well, part of it's just his willingness not to play basketball. I mean, even the year before,
Yeah, he took
he took time off. He just took 2 weeks off.
His unavailability has certainly been a source of contention within the organization, no question about it. But when he is on the court, he's an electrifying talent, and they form one of the most dynamic 1-2 punches in the league. So that's the caveat there at that. So we shall see.
Yeah, we shall see. So Kevin Durant has at least maybe he's putting pressure on the Nets. Maybe the release, well, I don't know, the leak or whatever, that he is willing to look around at other teams and force a trade if Kyrie leaves, was really pressure to just get the Nets to close in on keeping Kyrie in the fold as opposed to having him look around. But if Kyrie leaves and the Nets don't want to sign him to what Kyrie wants, and he goes somewhere else, what are the chances Kevin Durant insists on a trade out of he's got 4 years left on his deal, I think.
It all depends on then what the contingency plan would be for the Nets to replace Kyrie Irving. If you're going to do, a situation where it's either a sign and trade or, an opt-in and then he's flipped, however you want to do it, what are then the scenarios for them to replace Kyrie Irving? That's then the follow-up. Nobody knows for sure yet. I think to say that would evaluate options would be accurate because you don't know what it's going to be at that point. You have to give it a little time and see. Time will tell. We still got, I think, a few days before things start to really crystallize.
Okay. So basically on the Deandre Ayton front, you've got the Pistons potentially, although now that they got that young center, maybe not. You got the Spurs potentially, the Hawks, the Pacers. Are there any other teams besides those that could be interested in Deandre Ayton that you've heard of?
I mean, let's say, Detroit, Atlanta, San Antonio, maybe Indiana, maybe. Although I don't think Indiana, given the fact that they're in a rebuild again, I don't think they're going to want to pay him a max per se. But we'll see. It's possible. I've basically crossed out Portland, thinking that Nurkic is going back there. Uh,
Yeah, and they look like they're if
that's
they
kind of
can.
where
I don't know if they're going to get OG and Anunoby there, but they certainly already got Jeremy Grant, and if they bring back Yusuf Nurkic, they're looking pretty good for next year.
I think that I think OG Anunoby. This is what I would say. If OG Anunoby's getting traded, I think it's for an elite guy like Rudy Gobert. I mean, that's who Toronto would want for sure. And I'm pretty confident they would want him more than Miles Turner, for example, in an upgrade for a center. So yeah, I if you're gonna
Let me ask on Toronto. So we've heard about the other centers, right? Rudy, you just mentioned Rudy Gobert, Miles Turner. That how come Deandre Ayton has not come up in that conversation where the Suns would get Anunoby?
that would be an interesting scenario.
Because
Um,
Anunoby would fit into that weird base year compensation rule that they'd have to trade Ayton under and all. Toronto's looking for a center. Ayton's mobile. He's more mobile than Rudy. That would be, but you haven't heard anything on that front.
Not yet. No, I mean, I'm certainly going to keep digging, but not yet. And I mean, as you can tell, like I'm buzzing away
Yeah.
here. So yeah,
Yeah.
kind of.
Okay. Well, let me know if you do hear that, and hopefully we'll have you on again sometime soon. Thank you so much for your time today, Michael. Let us know where we can find you and where we should be looking over the next few weeks, if not few years.
Sure thing, Dave. I mean, you can certainly keep up with my tweets at Mike A. Scotto, Mike. A is in Anthony, Scotto, Scotto, hoopshype.com. Check out the Hoopshype podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. We had been doing team off-season previews throughout. And those were a lot of fun, bringing on some beat writers as well and chopping it up back and forth with my own original reporting and their thoughts as well. Certainly check that out. And it's going to be a busy summer coming up. So looking forward to
Yeah,
it.
it is. All right. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate you, man.
My pleasure.